October 15th, 1946. The afternoon sun slants through high windows into the processing center at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, where 37 Japanese prisoners of war stand in silent formation. The smell of disinfectant hangs in the air, sharp and chemical, mixing with the scent of autumn leaves carried through open doorways. These men, soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army captured across the Pacific Islands, transported first to Hawaii, then across the ocean to the American mainland, have been ordered to remove their tattered uniforms and proceed to the shower facilities. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto stands rigid, his calloused hands clenched at his sides, his body tensed for what he has been taught his entire military career to expect. Humiliation, brutality, the systematic destruction of human dignity that he believes defines the treatment of prisoners in war. Around him, his fellow captives exchange nervous glances, their eyes revealing the same dread, the same certainty that they are about to experience the barbarism that Japanese military propaganda promised would await any soldier dishonored enough to survive capture. Then the American sergeant opens the door to the shower room, and Yamamoto sees something that makes no sense within the framework of everything he has been taught about enemy cruelty. Rows of chrome shower heads gleaming under fluorescent lights, steam rising from floor drains, stacks of white towels on wooden benches, bars of soap wrapped in paper, and the sound of hot water rushing through pipes with a mechanical precision that speaks not of punishment, but of industrial efficiency applied to human care. This moment represented a collision between two fundamentally incompatible worldviews, a confrontation not of armies, but of ideologies made manifest in the simple mechanics of personal hygiene. The Japanese prisoners entering American POW camps in 1944 and 1945 carried with them assumptions forged through years of imperial military indoctrination. Assumptions that defined capture not merely as military defeat, but as spiritual obliteration, a fate worse than death itself. The Senjinkan, the Japanese military's ethical code distributed to every soldier, explicitly stated that surrender meant eternal disgrace, that prisoners could expect no mercy from enemies whose very nature was defined by their lack of bushido, the warrior spirit that supposedly distinguished Japanese soldiers from all others. These men had been taught that Americans, particularly, were soft, decadent, materialistic creatures whose wealth made them weak, whose industrial society produced cowards incapable of understanding honor, sacrifice, or the brutal necessities of total war. They expected treatment consistent with this ideology, systematic cruelty designed to break spirits, degradation intended to confirm their worthlessness, conditions that would make them regret every moment they continued to draw breath instead of having died honorably in combat. Instead, they encountered something far more psychologically destabilizing than cruelty. They encountered American abundance made routine, industrial democracy applied to the mundane necessities of daily life, a systematic approach to hygiene that revealed a civilization operating according to principles they had been taught did not exist in the materialistic West. The shower facilities at Camp McCoy, replicated in dozens of POW camps across the continental United States and Hawaii, represented not American generosity or kindness, though elements of both were present, but American normalcy, the baseline standard that American society considered appropriate for any human being under its authority, whether citizen, soldier, or enemy prisoner. The hot water that flowed through those chrome shower heads was the same water that flowed through shower heads in American homes, heated by the same industrial infrastructure, distributed through the same municipal systems that served civilian populations. The soap was manufactured to the same standards, wrapped in the same paper, distributed through the same logistics networks that supplied American troops, American hospitals, American schools. The towels were washed in the same industrial laundries, dried by the same machines, folded according to the same standards. Everything about the shower facilities spoke to a profound truth that Japanese military propaganda had either denied or failed to comprehend. That American industrial society had achieved such abundance that even its enemies could be housed, fed, cleaned, and cared for according to standards that exceeded anything these prisoners had experienced during their entire military service to the emperor. Yamamoto hesitates at the threshold, his body involuntarily resisting forward movement even though the American guards have made no threatening gestures, have not raised their voices or their weapons. His hesitation stems not from physical fear, but from cognitive dissonance so profound it borders on paralysis. The facilities before him simply do not match the template of captivity that has been burned into his consciousness through 2 years of military training. He remembers the lectures delivered by officers fresh from the China front, their descriptions of how American and British prisoners were starved, beaten, worked to death in conditions designed to strip away every pretense of human dignity. He remembers the propaganda films showing dissolute Western prisoners crawling in their own filth, broken creatures who had forfeited any claim to respect by their failure to die rather than surrender. He remembers most vividly the oath he took upon entering the Imperial Army, the promise that death was preferable to the shame of capture, that surrender meant accepting treatment fit only for animals. Yet here before him are facilities that exceed in cleanliness and functionality anything he experienced at his home garrison in Kyushu. Better maintained than the barracks where he trained, more modern than the field facilities where he bathed, when he bathed at all, during his service in the Pacific. The contrast between Japanese military hygiene standards and American POW facilities was so stark that many prisoners initially assumed the shower facilities were some form of elaborate deception, a cruel joke designed to lower their guard before the real brutality began. This assumption was not paranoia but rational extrapolation from their experience of the Imperial Japanese military, where hygiene was often treated as a luxury rather than a necessity, where battlefield conditions reduced personal cleanliness to whatever could be accomplished with cold water from streams or captured wells, where soap was scarce and hot water virtually non-existent except for officers. The average Japanese soldier deployed to the Pacific Islands, places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Okinawa, might go weeks or months without a proper bath, maintaining hygiene through whatever improvised methods were available. The ocean served as the primary washing facility for many island garrisons, with soldiers bathing in salt water that left their skin sticky and their clothes stiff with salt crystals. Fresh water, always scarce, was reserved for drinking and cooking. Soap, when available at all, was distributed in quantities so small that soldiers learned to make a single bar last for months, using it sparingly if at all, accepting the itching discomfort of unwashed skin, the persistent smell of sweat-soaked uniforms, the inevitable infestations of lice and other parasites as normal conditions of military service. The ideology that made this level of deprivation acceptable was rooted in the fundamental principles of Bushido as interpreted by the imperial military system. Physical comfort was seen as weakness, a distraction from the spiritual purity required of true warriors. Suffering was not merely endured, but celebrated as evidence of dedication to the emperor and the nation. The soldier who complained about lack of food, inadequate shelter, or poor hygiene was demonstrating insufficient spiritual development, revealing himself unworthy of the honor of serving the divine emperor. This ideology pervaded every level of Japanese military culture, from the newest conscript to the most senior officers, creating an environment where personal deprivation was normalized and even valorized. Veterans who had served in Manchuria or China spoke with pride about surviving on handfuls of rice per day, about marching for days without water, about enduring winters with inadequate clothing, and summers with no shelter from the sun. These stories were not told as critiques of logistics failures or command incompetence, but as demonstrations of Japanese spiritual superiority, evidence that Japanese soldiers could accomplish through willpower and dedication what no Western army could achieve even with superior equipment and supplies. The American sergeant, a middle-aged man from Wisconsin with the weathered face of someone who has spent his life working with his hands, notices Yamamoto's hesitation and misinterprets it as confusion about the procedure. Through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier from the Military Intelligence Service, he explains in simple terms that prisoners are to enter the showers in groups of 10, that they will have 15 minutes of hot water, that they should use the soap provided and dry themselves with the towels stacked on the benches. The towels will be collected and washed after use. Fresh clothes will be distributed after the shower. Medical personnel will inspect each man for wounds, disease, or parasitic infections. Any health issues will be treated. The interpreter delivers this information in clipped, formal Japanese, his accent marking him as a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, which adds another layer of confusion to Yamamoto's already overloaded comprehension. This man who looks Japanese who speaks Japanese with the accent of someone who grew up hearing the language at home, is wearing an American uniform, serving as a bridge between the captors and the captured, seeming comfortable in his role as part of the American military machine. The presence of Japanese-American interpreters in POW camps represented another cognitive shock for Japanese prisoners, challenging fundamental assumptions about racial loyalty and national identity that were central to Japanese militarist ideology. The prisoners had been taught that racial identity trumped all other loyalties, that blood ties created bonds stronger than mere citizenship or political philosophy. The existence of Japanese Americans who had chosen to fight for America against Japan, who had volunteered to serve as translators and interrogators, despite the incarceration of their own families in American detention camps, contradicted everything the imperial military had taught about the nature of racial consciousness. These Nisei soldiers, products of American society who maintained cultural connections to Japan, represented a hybrid identity that Japanese militarist ideology insisted was impossible. Their very existence suggested that loyalty was a choice rather than a racial destiny, that cultural identity could transcend bloodlines, that individuals could belong fully to societies that did not share their ethnic heritage. Yamamoto forces himself to move forward, entering the shower room with 9 other prisoners. The floor is tiled, sloped toward drains that carry away used water. The tiles are clean, not merely swept but actually clean, washed with what must be regular application of water and cleaning agents. The walls are white, painted with a finish that resists moisture and mold. The ceiling is high enough that even the tallest men can stand upright without stooping. The shower heads themselves are positioned at shoulder height, chrome fittings that gleam under the fluorescent lights, each one equipped with 2 knobs, one marked with blue, one with red, whose function becomes obvious when the first prisoner to reach the controls tentatively turns the red knob and is immediately rewarded with a stream of hot water that sends steam rising into the cool air. Hot water, on demand, unlimited, apparently, flowing with pressure that suggests industrial pumps and modern plumbing systems, rather than the hand-pumped buckets or gravity-fed pipes that characterize Japanese field facilities. The symbolic significance of hot water in this context extended far beyond mere physical comfort. Hot water represented energy expenditure, fuel consumption, industrial infrastructure dedicated to a purpose that had no direct military value. Every gallon of hot water required energy to heat it, whether coal, oil, gas, or electricity. And energy was a strategic resource, the very resource whose scarcity had driven Japan's imperial expansion and ultimately brought it into conflict with the United States. Japanese soldiers had fought and died to secure access to oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, rubber plantations in Malaya, coal mines in Manchuria. The Japanese home islands, resource-poor and industrially strained, had implemented strict rationing that affected every aspect of civilian and military life. Fuel that could heat water was fuel that could not power ships, drive trucks, or generate electricity for factories. The decision to use that fuel to provide hot showers for enemy prisoners would have been incomprehensible to Japanese military planners operating within a resource-constrained paradigm, where every strategic decision involved tragic choices between competing necessities. But America operated within a different paradigm entirely. American industrial capacity, powered by domestic oil fields that produced more petroleum than the rest of the world combined, by coal reserves that seemed inexhaustible, by electrical generating capacity that exceeded the wildest dreams of Japanese planners, made questions of fuel allocation for prisoner hygiene trivial to the point of irrelevance. The hot water flowing through Camp McCoy's showers represented a rounding error in American energy consumption, a quantity so small that it barely registered in the calculations of the quartermasters responsible for POW camp operations. This abundance, not merely of water or fuel, but of the industrial capacity to treat both as effectively unlimited resources, spoke to fundamental differences in how the two societies approached the relationship between means and ends, between available resources and organizational priorities. The soap is American, manufactured by Procter & Gamble according to standards established for military supply. Each bar is individually wrapped in paper printed with the manufacturer's name and the designation U.S. government property. The paper wrapping is itself a small marvel, clean, dry, printed with clear lettering, designed to keep the soap sanitary until use. Yamamoto takes a bar, unwraps it slowly, and holds it in his hands, feeling the smooth surface, the weight of it. The clean, chemical smell that is entirely unlike the harsh, lye-heavy soap occasionally distributed to Japanese troops. This soap is designed to be used, designed to dissolve in water and create lather, designed with the assumption that there will be enough of it, that its consumption is not a crisis requiring careful rationing, but a normal event that will be repeated daily. That tomorrow there will be more soap, and the day after that more soap, an endless supply chain stretching back to factories where soap is manufactured in quantities sufficient to meet the needs of millions of soldiers and millions of prisoners and millions of civilians all at once. The industrial production of soap, a commodity so basic that its availability was taken for granted by Americans, and so scarce that its absence was accepted as normal by Japanese soldiers, illustrated the vast gulf in manufacturing capacity that underlay every other difference between the two societies. American soap manufacturing in 1945 was a mature industry operating at scales that seemed almost incomprehensible to those unfamiliar with American industrial organization. Procter & Gamble alone operated 17 manufacturing facilities, producing hundreds of thousands of tons of soap products annually. The raw materials, fats, oils, and lye, were sourced from American agriculture and chemical industries with excess capacity, processed through automated manufacturing lines, packaged using machinery that could wrap thousands of bars per hour, and distributed through logistics networks that moved supplies from factories to military depots to frontline units and POW camps with mechanical efficiency. The soap in Yamamoto's hands had traveled thousands of miles, passing through multiple transportation modes, truck, rail, ship, and remained sanitary through the entire journey because American logistics treated sanitation as a foundational requirement rather than an aspirational goal. The shower begins tentatively, with prisoners approaching the water as if it might burn or scald despite the evidence of their own eyes that the first man to enter suffered no harm. Years of conditioning, of learning that anything offered by an enemy must be a trap, cannot be overcome instantly even by evidence that contradicts those assumptions. But cold and filth eventually overcome caution. Yamamoto positions himself under a shower head, reaches up to adjust the knobs, finds a balance between hot and cold that produces water at a temperature he had forgotten could exist. Not the lukewarm, barely heated water of the occasional bath in garrison, not the cold shock of river or ocean water, but actually hot water, hot enough to create steam, hot enough to relax muscles tensed with months of stress and deprivation, hot enough to feel like warmth penetrating not just skin, but something deeper, something he had not even recognized as cold until this moment of thawing. The physical sensation of hot water after months or years of deprivation had psychological effects that went beyond mere comfort. Human bodies respond to warmth in ways that bypass conscious thought, triggering relaxation responses at a neurological level. Muscles that had been chronically tensed, maintaining defensive postures against threats both physical and psychological, began to relax. Heart rate slowed, breathing deepened. The hot water was not merely cleaning bodies, but, in a very real physiological sense, providing the first moment of genuine relaxation many of these men had experienced since their capture, possibly since their deployment to combat zones, perhaps since their induction into a military system that treated all physical comfort as weakness. This relaxation carried its own kind of danger to men who had learned to maintain constant vigilance, whose survival had depended on never fully relaxing, never fully trusting, never allowing themselves the vulnerability that comes with genuine comfort. The soap lathers in ways that Japanese military soap never did, creating thick foam that spreads easily across skin, lifting away dirt and sweat, and the accumulated grime of transport ships and holding facilities. The water running off bodies turns gray with the dissolution of weeks' worth of filth, carrying away the visible evidence of conditions that prisoners had accepted as normal, as simply the way things were. Yamamoto scrubs methodically, following the habits drilled into him during basic training. Face, neck, armpits, torso, groin, legs, feet. Each area cleaned with the systematic thoroughness that the imperial military considered essential to discipline, even if the facilities to maintain that discipline were rarely available. Around him, other prisoners are going through similar rituals, each man reverting to the habits of cleanliness they learned before the war, in homes where bathing was a cherished ritual, where public baths served as social centers, where cleanliness was associated not with military discipline, but with cultural identity, with the distinction between civilization and barbarism that Japanese society had historically used to define itself. The Japanese cultural emphasis on bathing and cleanliness made the deprivation of hygiene facilities during military service particularly significant. Traditional Japanese culture, shaped by Shinto concepts of purification and Buddhist practices of ritual cleanliness, had developed elaborate bathing customs that were integral to social and family life. The afuro, the deep soaking tub where family members bathed in careful sequence, was a fixture of Japanese homes. Public sento, bathhouses where working-class Japanese gathered daily, served social functions that transcended mere hygiene, becoming centers of community interaction and relaxation. The implicit claim of Japanese military propaganda, that Western societies were inherently less civilized, less concerned with cleanliness, more barbaric in their personal habits, drew power from these cultural traditions, suggesting that Japanese dedication to cleanliness was evidence of cultural superiority. The reality that Japanese soldiers experienced in military service, the systematic denial of the very bathing facilities that Japanese culture celebrated, created cognitive dissonance that was managed through the ideology of spiritual transcendence, the belief that true warriors could endure any deprivation in service to the emperor. Now, standing under American showers using American soap, prisoners were confronted with evidence that the Americans had not merely matched, but exceeded the cleanliness standards that Japanese culture valued. The contradiction was profound. If Americans were soft, decadent, and materialistic, why did they provide better hygiene facilities for their prisoners than Japan provided for its own soldiers? If American concern with comfort indicated weakness, why had the comfortable Americans won the war while the spiritually superior Japanese suffered total defeat? These questions had no comfortable answers within the ideological framework prisoners carried with them into captivity. The 15 minutes allocated for showers passes in a state of semi-disbelief. As the time expires, an American corporal signals through gestures that the prisoners should turn off the water and proceed to the drying area. The towels provided are white terry cloth, worn but clean, smelling faintly of bleach and detergent, thick enough to actually absorb water rather than merely smearing it across skin. Yamamoto takes a towel and dries himself systematically, the action so normal and routine that its very normality seems surreal in this context. He is drying himself after a hot shower, using a clean towel in an enemy POW camp, and nothing about this experience matches what he was taught to expect. The towel will be taken away and washed and provided to other prisoners tomorrow, or the day after, part of a cycle of cleanliness that operates with mechanical regularity, that assumes continuing access to water, soap, bleach, washing machines, dryers, all the industrial infrastructure necessary to maintain hygiene standards at a level that treats cleanliness not as a privilege, but as a baseline expectation. The laundry facilities supporting POW camp hygiene represented another dimension of American industrial organization that had no parallel in Japanese military logistics. Camp McCoy's laundry operation processed thousands of towels, uniforms, and bed linens daily, using commercial-grade washing machines and dryers powered by electricity or steam. The detergent was manufactured in bulk by American chemical companies. The bleach was similarly mass-produced. The machinery was maintained by skilled personnel, using manufactured parts that were readily available through supply networks. The entire operation ran with the efficiency of a commercial laundry service, because in essence, that is what it was. Commercial technology and commercial organization applied to military requirements, with the characteristic American assumption that civilian industrial capacity could be adapted to any organizational need simply by applying resources and systematic management. Japanese military logistics operated according to fundamentally different principles. The Imperial Army's supply system was hampered by industrial limitations, by the requirement to transport supplies across vast oceanic distances through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines, by a cultural emphasis on endurance over comfort that made hygiene supplies a low priority even when resources were available. Japanese quartermasters who struggled to provide sufficient rice and ammunition to forward units could hardly be expected to prioritize soap and laundry facilities. The implicit message sent to Japanese soldiers was that personal hygiene was the soldier's individual responsibility, to be managed through whatever improvised means were available. The collective responsibility that American military culture assumed for maintaining the health and morale of its personnel through systematic provision of hygiene facilities was conceptually foreign to Japanese military organization, which treated such provisions as luxuries inappropriate during a period of national emergency. After drying, prisoners are directed to a medical inspection area, where American and Nisei medical personnel conduct brief examinations. The personnel are professional, efficient, and utterly matter-of-fact in their approach, treating the examination as a routine medical procedure rather than an opportunity for humiliation. Yamamoto is checked for wounds, though his capture occurred months ago and the minor injuries from that engagement have long since healed. He is checked for signs of malnutrition and finds himself being given protein supplements and vitamin tablets because American medical standards consider his weight insufficient for his height. He is checked for parasites and finds himself being treated with DDT powder as a precautionary measure. He is asked through the interpreter whether he has any medical complaints, and the question itself is so unexpected that he cannot formulate a coherent answer. The assumption underlying the question, that his health matters, that the Americans are interested in maintaining it, that he has agency to identify and report his own medical needs, contradicts everything he has been taught about captivity. The medical care provided to POWs was governed by the Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified, and to which it adhered with a rigor born of both legal obligation and cultural values. American medical personnel treating POWs operated under the same professional standards and ethical guidelines that governed treatment of American personnel. This was not sentimentality or unnecessary kindness, but systematic application of international law, as interpreted by a society with strong legalistic traditions and institutional structures that enforced compliance even in contexts where oversight was limited. The medical officers who examined Yamamoto had trained at American medical schools, had taken oaths to provide care according to professional standards, and operated within a military medical system that maintained those standards through inspection regimes, documentation requirements, and professional accountability structures. The vitamins and nutritional supplements prescribed to underweight prisoners reflected both the medical understanding that malnutrition compromised health and the logistical reality that American military medicine had ready access to pharmaceutical products that were manufactured in massive quantities by American chemical and pharmaceutical industries. The DDT used to prevent parasitic infections was a recent wartime innovation, manufactured by American chemical companies and distributed widely to American forces as prophylaxis against lice, fleas, and other disease vectors. Its use on POWs was standard procedure, motivated by the practical concern that parasitic diseases in POW populations could spread to American personnel, and by the medical obligation to provide treatment that met professional standards regardless of the patient's nationality or combatant status. The clean clothes provided after medical inspection are American uniforms that have been dyed to indicate POW status. The standard olive drab denim fatigues marked with conspicuous letters spelling PW in white paint across the back of the jacket and down the leg of the trousers. The clothing itself is worn but serviceable, laundered clean, sized approximately correctly through a distribution system that maintains a range of sizes despite the variability of prisoner builds. Yamamoto puts on the clothes and experiences another moment of cognitive dissonance. He is wearing enemy uniform, marked to identify him as a prisoner, yet the clothes are clean and intact and warmer than the tropical uniform in which he was captured, more suitable for the Wisconsin autumn than anything in Japanese military supply had provided. The underwear is American, the socks are American, the boots are American Army surplus, sized and distributed with the same systematic efficiency that characterized every other aspect of the processing procedure. The question of what to do with enemy uniforms illustrated the different approaches American and Japanese military systems took to resource management. Japanese military protocol would have required that captured enemy equipment be salvaged, repaired if necessary, and redistributed to Japanese forces or civilian population according to need. Waste was unacceptable in a resource-scarce economy. Every piece of cloth, every working button, every intact boot represented materials that could be used by the empire. The American approach reflected different constraints and different values. American industry produced clothing in such quantities that the marginal value of captured enemy uniforms was minimal. Sorting, cleaning, and redistributing worn Japanese uniforms would cost more in labor than manufacturing new American uniforms cost in materials and industrial capacity. The decision to provide POWs with American clothing dyed to mark POW status was therefore less generous than practical, a solution that leveraged American manufacturing capacity while maintaining security and addressing Geneva Convention requirements for providing adequate clothing to prisoners. The transformation from filthy, ragged prisoner to clean, fed, clothed human being occurs in less than 2 hours. Yamamoto emerges from the processing center into the autumn afternoon and sees his fellow prisoners similarly transformed, cleaned and dressed in matching POW uniforms, standing in formation awaiting further instructions. They look like soldiers again, rather than starving refugees. The clean uniforms impose a kind of military order on their appearance that had been eroded by months of captivity and transport. They stand straighter, move with more discipline, recover some measure of the military identity that capture had stripped away. The simple act of being clean, of having been treated with the systematic efficiency that they recognize as military organization even if it is enemy military organization, has restored something they had lost. Not honor, perhaps, which the shame of capture had destroyed, but functionality, the capacity to understand their role within a structured system operating according to comprehensible rules. This psychological transformation was precisely what American POW policy intended to achieve. The U.S. military's approach to prisoner management was influenced by the belief that orderly, healthy prisoners who understood their treatment to be generally fair were easier to manage than desperate, diseased prisoners who had nothing to lose. The provision of adequate hygiene facilities, medical care, food, and shelter was therefore not primarily motivated by humanitarian concern, though such concern existed among individual personnel, but by practical operational considerations. Clean, healthy prisoners were less likely to spread disease to American personnel. Well-fed prisoners were more cooperative and provided better intelligence during interrogation. Prisoners who understood themselves to be treated according to consistent rules were more likely to follow those rules. The entire system reflected characteristic American confidence that systematic organization, adequate resources, and clear procedures could transform any problem into a manageable administrative challenge. The barracks to which prisoners are assigned after processing represent another shock to expectations. The buildings are wooden structures, standard military construction, similar in design to the barracks housing American troops. Each building contains rows of bunk beds, each bunk equipped with a mattress, pillow, and blankets. The mattresses are not thick, but they exist, filled with cotton or synthetic fill rather than straw or nothing. The blankets are wool, the standard American military blankets manufactured in large quantities by American textile mills. The pillows are stuffed with fiber, covered with cotton ticking. The combination, mattress, blanket, pillow, represents sleeping accommodations superior to what many prisoners experienced during their military service, certainly superior to anything they experienced on the transport ships that brought them to America, and utterly unlike the bare floors or wooden planks they expected in a POW camp. The provision of beds with mattresses to prisoners was policy driven by both Geneva Convention requirements and practical American assumptions about what constituted necessary accommodations for any group of people held under military authority. American military culture, shaped by a society where even working-class citizens expected certain minimum standards of accommodation, carried those expectations into all military operations, including prisoner management. The notion that prisoners might sleep on bare ground or wooden planks without bedding struck American administrators as both practically problematic. Uncomfortable prisoners might become unmanageable prisoners, and unnecessarily cruel in a system where providing basic bedding required only modest allocation of resources that America possessed in abundance. The barracks also contained heating systems, wood or coal stoves at minimum, sometimes more sophisticated heating systems, that would maintain tolerable temperatures during Wisconsin winters. The provision of heating represented another example of American abundance applied to prisoner management. Fuel to heat barracks was fuel that could not heat American homes or power American industry. But American fuel production was sufficient that the allocation to POW heating represented no significant sacrifice. The alternative, allowing prisoners to freeze in unheated barracks during Wisconsin winters, would create health crises that would require medical resources to address. And American administrators operated with the characteristic confidence that preventing problems through adequate resource allocation was more efficient than treating problems that arose from inadequate allocation. The daily routine established for prisoners at Camp McCoy followed military discipline that Japanese soldiers recognized even as they adjusted to its American implementation. Reveille at 0600, followed by morning formation, breakfast at 0630, work assignments or other activities through the day, dinner at 1800, evening formation, lights out at 2200. The routine was structured, predictable, and enforced with the expectation that prisoners would conform to established procedures. What made the routine remarkable was not its structure, but its content. Breakfast consisted of hot cereal, bread, butter, coffee, and often eggs or meat, providing approximately 2,800 calories per day according to American military standards. The rations provided to prisoners matched or exceeded the rations provided to Japanese soldiers in the field, and certainly exceeded the rations prisoners expected to receive as captives. The 2,800-calorie daily ration for POWs was established by U.S. military policy in compliance with Geneva Convention requirements and reflected characteristic American assumptions about adequate nutrition. American nutritional science, well developed by 1945, had established that adult males performing moderate physical labor required approximately 2,800 calories per day to maintain health and body weight. The fact that Japanese soldiers in the field often operated on 1,500-2,000 calories per day, and that Japanese civilians were surviving on even less due to wartime rationing, did not alter American policy, which was based on American standards rather than comparative assessment of enemy practices. This inflexibility in maintaining American standards, regardless of what enemy nations considered adequate, reflected both American abundance. The United States could afford to feed prisoners according to American standards, and American legalism, policy established according to international law, would be followed regardless of reciprocity. The food itself represented a revelation for prisoners whose military service had taught them to view chronic hunger as normal. The bread was wheat bread, baked fresh in camp kitchens, available in quantities sufficient that prisoners could eat until satisfied rather than merely surviving on carefully rationed portions. The butter was real butter, manufactured by American dairies, distributed through military supply channels that treated dairy products as routine provisions rather than luxury items. The coffee was genuine coffee, not the various substitutes that Japanese civilians and military personnel had been drinking since American submarines cut off imports from the Dutch East Indies. The eggs were real eggs. The meat, when provided, was real meat. Beef, pork, or chicken, not the occasional fish or rare luxury that meat had become in Japanese military rations. The abundance was so stark that many prisoners initially believed it must be temporary. A special meal provided during processing, before reverting to the starvation rations they expected as normal prisoner treatment. When the abundant meals continued day after day, prisoners were forced to confront the reality that American food supply was operating at a level that made adequate nutrition for prisoners a sustainable policy rather than an unsustainable gesture. The implications were profound. If America could feed its prisoners this well while simultaneously feeding its own population, its military forces around the world, and providing lend-lease supplies to allied nations, then American agricultural and industrial capacity exceeded Japanese estimates by orders of magnitude. The food on prisoners' plates became evidence of defeat more convincing than any battlefield outcome. It demonstrated that Japan had challenged an industrial power whose resource base was so vast that feeding enemy prisoners according to generous standards represented no significant burden on overall capacity. The shower schedule established for prisoners provided access to hot showers twice per week, with additional cold water washing facilities available daily. This schedule exceeded anything Japanese soldiers had experienced during military service, and established routine access to hygiene facilities as a normal expectation rather than an occasional privilege. The implications rippled through prisoner consciousness as days became weeks and weeks became months. The Americans were not simply maintaining the facilities as a temporary measure or a trick. They were maintaining them as permanent operational infrastructure. as part of the systematic organization of camp operations. The hot water continued to flow, the soap continued to be provided, the towels continued to be washed and redistributed. The system operated with mechanical regularity that spoke to industrial supply chains functioning behind the scenes. Quartermaster operations maintaining inventory, maintenance personnel keeping equipment operational. All the invisible infrastructure of American military logistics functioning as designed. The recurring symbol of the shower, the chrome showerhead, the hot water, the steam, the clean towels, became for many prisoners the embodiment of American industrial civilization, the physical manifestation of a society organized around different principles than those that governed Japanese military culture, where Japanese military organization celebrated endurance of deprivation as evidence of spiritual superiority. American military organization treated adequate provision of necessities as evidence of organizational competence, where Japanese logistics struggled to provide basics due to resource constraints. American logistics provided basics with such abundance that excess capacity could be allocated to prisoner welfare without compromising primary military operations. The shower represented not kindness but capacity, not sentiment but systematization, not deviation from American military norms, but adherence to those norms. As months passed and prisoners adjusted to the routines of camp life, the psychological impact of adequate hygiene facilities interacted with other aspects of American POW treatment to create ideological crises among men who had built their identities on assumptions about Japanese superiority and American weakness. The provision of medical care without torture, of food without starvation, of shelter without deliberate cruelty, of organized work without brutalization, accumulated into a pattern that contradicted every prediction Japanese propaganda had made about American treatment of prisoners. The contradiction could not be resolved through minor adjustments to existing worldviews. It required fundamental reconsideration of the premises on which those worldviews had been constructed. Some prisoners responded to this crisis through denial, maintaining that American treatment was strategic deception designed to weaken their resolve, that the seemingly humane conditions were intended to make them betray their emperor through collaboration. These prisoners remained psychologically at war, treating every American kindness as a trap, every comfort as a temptation to be resisted. They maintained rigid adherence to Japanese military discipline among themselves, organized informal command structures that enforced continued loyalty to imperial ideology, and actively resisted camp authorities' attempts to introduce recreational activities or educational programs. For these men, the showers remained suspect, the food remained poisonous in principle if not in fact, and the entire American system remained enemy action to be resisted rather than conditions to be accepted. Other prisoners responded through transformation, beginning to question the ideology that had shaped their understanding of the war, their enemies, and themselves. These men noted that the Americans who provided hot showers and adequate food were the same Americans who had defeated Japan in every major engagement, that the society capable of organizing efficient POW camps was the same society whose industrial might had overwhelmed Japanese capacity, that the enemy they had been taught to despise as weak and decadent had proven stronger and more competent than the military system that had promised them victory. This recognition led some to interrogate other assumptions about the war's causes, about the emperor's divinity, about Japan's destined role in Asia, about the whole edifice of militarist ideology that had justified years of war and millions of deaths. The shower became, for these men, a portal to recognizing the lies they had been told and the truth they had been prevented from seeing. The Military Intelligence Service, the branch of American military responsible for prisoner interrogation and intelligence gathering, recognized early in the Pacific War that Japanese prisoners provided extraordinary intelligence value precisely because Japanese military culture had not prepared soldiers for the possibility of capture and therefore had not trained them in resistance to interrogation. The assumption that no Japanese soldier would survive to become prisoner meant that no security protocols existed to protect information after capture. Soldiers carried detailed maps, unit diaries, operational orders, and technical documents into combat. Officers possessed comprehensive understanding of strategic plans. The combination of captured documents and cooperative prisoners provided American intelligence with insights into Japanese operations that would have been impossible to obtain through signals intelligence or other collection methods alone. The interrogation approach developed by American intelligence exploited the psychological vulnerability created by the contradiction between expected treatment and actual treatment. Prisoners who entered American custody expecting torture and execution found themselves instead provided comfortable accommodations, adequate food, medical care, and ultimately respect for their cultural practices within the constraints of captivity. Interrogators trained in Japanese language and culture by the Military Intelligence Service Language School conducted interviews that emphasized respect, cultural sensitivity, and recognition of prisoners' military service. The interrogators understood that most prisoners experienced profound shame about their capture and needed psychological permission to cooperate that allowed them to maintain some internal sense of honor. The provision of good treatment created cognitive dissonance that interrogators exploited not through coercion, but through offering prisoners a framework for understanding cooperation as rational response to changing circumstances rather than betrayal of unchanging principles. The intelligence gathered through this approach was decisive in numerous Pacific campaigns. Prisoners provided detailed information about Japanese defensive preparations, troop dispositions, supply situations, and command structures. They identified locations of headquarters, ammunition dumps, and communication centers. They described morale conditions, training standards, and equipment shortages. They explained tactical doctrines, organizational structures, and operational procedures. The information they provided saved American lives by allowing American commanders to concentrate forces against weak points, avoid strength, and exploit vulnerabilities that would otherwise have required costly reconnaissance to identify. The shower facilities, the adequate rations, the medical care, all the seemingly humanitarian aspects of American POW policy served strategic intelligence purposes that justified their cost through the actionable intelligence they enabled. The transformation of individual prisoners was documented through letters to families, through statements made during repatriation after the war, through interviews conducted by occupation authorities in post-war Japan. Many former prisoners described their time in American camps as eye-opening, as the first opportunity they had to encounter Americans as human beings rather than as abstractions defined by propaganda. They described the cognitive dissonance of being treated better by their enemies than by their own military system, of receiving medical care that exceeded what they had received as Japanese soldiers, of eating food more abundant than what their families consumed at home. They described, often with evident bewilderment, the showers, the hot water, the soap, the clean towels, the systematic routine of cleanliness that had been maintained throughout their captivity, and that had come to represent for them the difference between a society of abundance and a society of deprivation, between a system that valued human welfare and a system that valorized human suffering. These testimonies, while subject to the biases and limitations of all oral histories, provide insight into the psychological impact of American POW treatment. Prisoners consistently emphasized material comforts, not because they were materialistic, but because material conditions served as concrete evidence of abstract differences between societies. The shower was not merely a shower. It was proof that American industrial capacity exceeded Japanese capacity, that American organizational competence exceeded Japanese competence, that American society had achieved prosperity that Japanese society had not achieved. The recognition of these differences led many former prisoners to support post-war democratic reforms in Japan, to advocate for Japan's integration into the American-led international order, and to become carriers of ideas about democracy, capitalism, and individual rights that had been considered alien to Japanese culture. The ideological transformation worked in service of American strategic interests in post-war Japan, turning former enemies into advocates for American influence. The broader context of Japanese POW treatment by Americans must be understood against the backdrop of how American and Allied prisoners were treated by Japanese forces. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, the countless work camps where prisoners were starved, beaten, and worked to death. These atrocities created strong pressure within American society for reciprocal brutality toward Japanese prisoners. American service personnel who had seen fellow soldiers tortured and executed wanted revenge. American civilians who learned of Japanese atrocities against prisoners and civilians demanded retribution. The decision to treat Japanese prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, despite Japan's systematic violation of those same standards, when handling Allied prisoners, required institutional commitment to legal principles over emotional response, to policy over passion. The rationale for this decision was complex. Legal considerations were significant. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention, and American military lawyers insisted on compliance with international law. Strategic considerations were important. Treating prisoners well-generated intelligence and created incentives for other Japanese soldiers to surrender rather than fight to death. Propaganda considerations were relevant. American treatment of prisoners could be publicized to demonstrate American moral superiority and contrast American practices with Japanese brutality. But perhaps most important were cultural considerations. American society's self-image as civilization fighting barbarism required that American practices reflect civilized norms even when dealing with uncivilized enemies. The decision to provide hot showers to Japanese prisoners while American prisoners were dying in Japanese camps was not weakness but strength, not sentimentality but confidence, not abandonment of justice, but commitment to principles that transcended immediate circumstances. The shower facilities at Camp McCoy and other POW camps continued to operate through the final months of the war and into the post-war period when prisoners awaited repatriation. The mechanical regularity of camp routines provided stability during a period when news of Japan's surrender, of atomic weapons, of total defeat, created psychological crises among prisoners who had to reconcile the impossibility of Japanese defeat with the reality of American victory. The mundane normalcy of scheduled showers, meals, work assignments, and recreational activities provided framework for prisoners to process information that shattered their understanding of the world. The hot water still flowed according to schedule. The soap was still provided without rationing. The towels were still washed and redistributed. The unchanging nature of these routines, while everything else in prisoners' worlds was collapsing, provided anchor to reality, evidence that life would continue even after defeat, that the mechanics of daily existence would persist even when the meanings that had given those mechanics purpose were destroyed. In the post-war period, as prisoners were repatriated to a Japan that had been transformed by defeat and occupation, many carried with them memories of American POW camps that shaped their understanding of America and influenced their responses to American occupation policies. The man who had experienced hot showers, adequate food, and medical care in American captivity was more likely to accept American claims about democracy and prosperity, more willing to cooperate with occupation authorities, more receptive to ideas about reforming Japanese society according to American models. The strategic value of humane POW treatment thus extended beyond wartime intelligence gathering to post-war political influence, creating a cohort of former prisoners whose experience of America contradicted Japanese propaganda and made them amenable to American influence in ways that would have been impossible had they experienced the brutality they had been taught to expect. The final symbolic meaning of the shower emerged in the contrast between the facilities that prisoners had experienced in American camps and the facilities they encountered upon return to devastated post-war Japan. Japanese cities had been destroyed by firebombing and atomic weapons. Infrastructure was collapsed, food was scarce, medical care was limited, clean water was not universally available. The public bath houses that had been centers of Japanese community life were destroyed or inoperable due to lack of fuel to heat water. Returned prisoners, arriving in a Japan that had been physically and psychologically destroyed by defeat, found that the hygiene standards they had experienced in American captivity exceeded what was available to Japanese civilians in their home country. This recognition that they had been treated better as prisoners of the enemy than their own families were being treated as citizens of the defeated nation completed the ideological transformation that had begun in the shower rooms of American POW camps. The returning prisoners became, in effect, witnesses to American abundance and Japanese deprivation, carrying with them embodied knowledge of the difference between societies. They had lived for months or years experiencing daily routines that demonstrated American capacity to provide for human needs at scales that Japanese society had never achieved even before the war. They returned to a Japan that was learning through occupation to accept American dominance not merely as military fact, but as cultural reality, as evidence of American superiority that went beyond temporary battlefield success to reflect deeper differences in social organization, economic systems, and cultural values. The shower, chrome shower heads, hot water, soap, clean towels, became in memory a symbol of the defeat of not just Japanese military forces, but of Japanese ideology, of the militaristic belief system that had promised spiritual superiority would triumph over material weakness, that Japanese endurance would overcome American decadence, that will could defeat wealth. The transformation of Japan during American occupation drew on the experiences of returned POWs among other factors. Men who had seen American organization, experienced American abundance, and survived American captivity became voices advocating for reform, for learning from American practices, for accepting that defeat reflected not merely military mistakes or strategic errors, but fundamental differences in how societies organized themselves to accomplish collective goals. The democratic constitution, the land reform, the labor reforms, the educational reforms, all the changes American occupation authorities imposed on Japan found receptive audiences among those who had experienced American society indirectly through POW treatment, and concluded that American practices, whatever their flaws, had produced a more prosperous, more organized, more effective society than Japanese militarism had created. The hot showers in American POW camps thus served purposes that transcended their immediate function. They were hygiene facilities, certainly, designed to maintain prisoner health and prevent disease. They were intelligence tools, creating psychological conditions that encouraged cooperation during interrogation. They were propaganda, demonstrating American moral superiority and civilizational achievement. They were strategic investments in post-war influence, creating experiences that would shape how Japanese society responded to American occupation. Most fundamentally, they were symbols of the difference between abundance and scarcity, between a society that treated hot water as a normal expectation and a society that had learned to survive without it, between a civilization that had industrialized human comfort and a civilization that had celebrated human suffering. The chrome shower heads, the steam, the soap, the clean towels. These mundane objects carried symbolic weight far exceeding their physical properties, becoming embodiments of the ideological struggle that underlay the physical conflict of World War II. And so the story of Japanese prisoners encountering American showers became a story about the nature of civilizations in conflict, about the relationships between material abundance and military power, about the ways that simple daily experiences shape understanding of complex political and ideological differences. The prisoner standing under hot water, soap in hand, clean towel waiting, experiencing comfort he had not expected and abundance he had been taught his enemies did not possess, underwent in that moment a transformation more profound than could be achieved through any amount of propaganda or political education. He learned through direct bodily experience that the ideology that had shaped his life was based on lies, that the promises of spiritual triumph over material weakness were empty, that the enemy he had been taught to despise possessed capabilities and organized society in ways that produced results superior to the system he had been taught to venerate. The hot water flowing from American pipes, heated by American fuel, distributed through American infrastructure, became the medium through which these lessons were taught, not through words but through the undeniable reality of physical comfort, not through argumentation but through the evidence of abundance, not through coercion, but through the paradoxical power of enemy generosity that revealed more clearly than any deliberate cruelty ever could the true magnitude of the defeat Japan had suffered. The shower remained in memory long after the water had stopped flowing, after the prisoners had been repatriated, after the camps had been closed, and the buildings repurposed or demolished. In the stories told by veterans, in the oral histories collected by researchers, in the memoirs published decades after the war, the shower appeared again and again as the moment when the war's real meaning became clear, when the abstractions of strategy and ideology became concrete in the experience of hot water and soap, when the difference between the societies that had fought for domination of the Pacific became manifest in the most mundane of human activities, the simple act of getting clean, that moment of standing under the shower, feeling hot water, using soap, becoming clean, That moment encapsulated the larger truth that the war had been decided not by courage or spirit or warrior values, but by industrial capacity and organizational competence, by the ability to produce abundance and distribute it efficiently, by the systematic application of material resources to human needs. The chrome showerhead, shining under fluorescent lights in a Wisconsin POW camp, became a monument to American victory more lasting and more meaningful than any battlefield memorial, a symbol of the triumph of industrial democracy over military authoritarianism, of abundance over deprivation, of a civilization that valued human comfort over a civilization that had celebrated human suffering in service to the divine emperor's impossible dreams of eternal empire.